Huge thank you for having me here. It's great to be back. I realized, I say back, it's been almost 3 years, certainly to the week, if not the day, from an autonomous vehicle presentation I co-presented with my dear friend, Poria Pekinjad. But quick background on me, tech founder, ended up doing a big podcast on autonomous vehicles, and more recently launched a law practice on AI law. So also do a newsletter on climate change, autonomous vehicles, and of course, AI. So let's dive in and get started here. Lots to cover. So yeah, in order to understand everything about AI law, it's super important first to understand, frankly, the technical inner workings of what's going on with AI. There isn't any possible way to fit this all into a 45-minute discussion. So I'll probably be calling out during the course of the lecture several bits of content that merit their own course altogether. But let's dive in and get started. I think there's no better way to do so than with a quote from the Bard, not Google Bard, of course, but the Bard himself. So this, of course, is a soliloquy from Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1. This is his famous to be or not to be speech, towards the end of which he makes reference to the undiscovered country. So what's interesting is that Hamlet was talking about the uncertainty of the afterlife, death, and whether it was indeed a worse fate than the hardships of life. Many, many hundreds of years later, Chancellor Gowron from the 6th Star Trek film, for those of you who might remember, likewise made a toast to the undiscovered country, to the future. And what's interesting, just a quick subtle difference here, is the future there was an altogether different concept to what Hamlet talked about, because, well, Hamlet was talking about death, arguably not much of a future, I suppose. In our case, though, it's a pretty apt title because we likewise are at the precipice of something truly revolutionary in humanity. I know I'm one to throw around hyperbole a lot. This is not hyperbole when I say that I think maybe the discovery of extraterrestrial bacteria on Mars or Moon or Titan might rise to the level of what we've got now with publicly available generative AI. Looking back in history, though, I think what we're going to see is the Gutenberg press, maybe not necessarily, possibly, well, certainly landing on the moon for the first time, but not necessarily even the internet, the first web browser, the first iPhone. But no, it's this generative AI. This really is that big of a deal. So I hope you all truly grasp this and don't take any of this for granted where we are right now and at this step change in human history and civilization. So quick overview, we're going to touch on what generative AI generally is and what it isn't, and certainly ChatGPT specifically. Obviously, we're going to do I was going to say deep dive, no, rather our brief overview of what there is in the very unsettled state of AI. We'll look into how best to integrate ChatGPT into your workflow and, crucially, what not to do. Time permitting, and I do think there is, I've tried this a few times now, we should be able to touch a bit on other sorts of AI currently available. And I really hope we can spend at least several minutes on what happens next. Where do we go from here? The risks, the dangers that you may have heard about now with AI, which are not, in fact, exaggerated and should be taken very seriously. So speaking of which, let's kick off with this. 50% of researchers believe there's a 10% or greater chance that humans go extinct from our inability to control AI. Some of you may have seen this video. It's a talk called The AI Dilemma. It was given the 9th of March of this year. The Center for Humane Technology, this is the organization that produced the phenomenal documentary, The Social Dilemma. If there's one thing that you watch, make it this talk. Just to put sort of a practical real world example of what this is like, imagine if you had a 10% chance of dying every time you got on a plane to fly somewhere. You probably wouldn't do it. That's kind of what we're talking about here. Again, we're going to circle back towards the end. There's going to be a lot of dots that we're going to try to connect, and hopefully, indeed, we manage to do so by the end. So what is ChatGPT exactly? Well, let's start with a quick overview of AI broadly. So going back to the 1950s, the Turing test, you may know, named after Alan Turing, the famous scientist who decrypted the Nazi code during World War II, that sought to establish a test for whether a thing is indistinguishable to a human if you talk with it. Fast forwarding through time a bit here, Okay, so in the 50s, artificial intelligence as a term seems to have been coined. In 1987, I think, as perhaps funny as it sounds, but I think legitimately worth pointing out, Star Trek first brought to life Commander Data. Okay, after Star Wars, sure, but I think Star Trek cast a very real light on what it means to truly be human, or not, as it were. In fact, this was just a really big theme that kind of kept resurfacing over and over the years. 10 years later, a computer beat a human at chess. More recently, Watson won at Jeopardy. AlphaGo beat the world's best human Go player. And of course, now here we are with OpenAI and other sorts of AI generally, including the likes of Midjourney, image generation tools like DALL-E. And by the way, all the imagery you see in this presentation, yeah, okay, so none of them necessarily have any bearing whatsoever to the present slide that they're on, but they are pretty fun and they give you a sense for what's capable. So where does that leave us, really? The 2030s will probably end up with what we see as AGI, artificial general intelligence, if not even sooner, and you'll understand why in a bit. As far as the so-called singularity that you may have heard of, that's sort of the point at which AI generally is simply more capable in every sense, at least cognitively, than humans. That's very likely sooner than we all thought. So speaking of data, what better quote than this to kick things off? If by your laws I am to be defined as a machine and not a man, then I must insist that I am a very exceptional machine. This then some of you might recognize as being from that famous, I think, 4th season episode where he was literally put on trial for his humanity. This seemed like far-fetched science fiction, honestly, until really November of last year when OpenAI released ChatGPT to the public. So it's not so far-fetched anymore, though. So what is ChatGPT? What we're going to talk about here is going to resurface a few times during the course of this talk, so don't be concerned if it doesn't fully make sense yet. There are many types of so-called generative AI. Generative because they, well, generate things. A subset of generative AI is a thing called an LLM. No, not that kind of LLM. These are large language models. And a subset of those is the actual product that OpenAI created called a GPT, of which ChatGPT is the product, the publicly facing product. So G is for generative, as I say it, outputs stuff. It's pre-trained, meaning it's literally fed or it's ingested with all this data from the internet, and then it pre-trains itself on that data. And then it's a transformer, also not that kind, which is able to understand context. So it can consider the context of each word. And this is why, for those of you who've played around with ChatGPT, you'll notice that it's totally context aware. You can reference prior parts of your discussion. It understands what words relate to what other words and so on and so forth. We're going to come back to this later, I promise. So it is fundamentally, as pure as can be said, natural language text. And indeed, even images, at least in certain cases. It's not yet superhuman cognition, at least not yet. And no, it isn't sentient, although there are apparently some glimmers of sentience bubbling forth, but not quite yet. I know some of you are probably already wondering, why are we going through all the technical background here? I firmly believe it's critically important to understand how this stuff works at a technical level in order to answer many of the legal questions that are going to be raised and indeed discussed later, including and especially issues around at least US copyright law. So please bear with me. I think you'll agree towards the end of this. What can ChatGPT and indeed other so-called LLM models do? Well, they can communicate in English or indeed any language, really. They'll create original novel content. We will, of course, discuss what this means with respect to copyright law. They're really incredibly capable at coding. And yeah, as I'm sure all of you have heard, they can now pass the bar exam in the 90th percentile. This is for the present ChatGPT version 4, which is a markedly better improvement over the previous 3.5 that originally released in November of last year. And yeah, these things are really good at pretending and simulating things. I think we'll touch on some of this later, but the point is you can pretty much ask them to do whatever you want as far as imitating a thing that you need it to be. I'm not going to just rattle off verbatim what you see in front of you, But suffice to say, this is a very non-exhaustive list of things. So there's really no limit to viable applications. Some may be considered less appropriate than others. I will call out some non-obvious ones, for instance, medical. So it turns out that AI generally, even way before ChatGPT, has already been incredibly capable at recognizing, for example, medical imagery like MRIs, CAT scans, and so forth. I think it's, I forget the actual metric now, but it is markedly better, for instance, at recognizing tumorous growths for mammograms, vastly superior to the human eye at recognizing these. So pretty incredible stuff. I will call out very briefly the last item on this list, only because this will kind of come back later in the presentation, especially when we discuss the EU approach to AI law, the issue of deep fakes. Some of you might have seen the Tom Cruise deep fake. This is a particularly crazy intersection of everything: language models, deep fakes, where you can simulate another face on somebody's, well, face. And this kind of opens up a whole can of worms about, what's truly real anymore. We just don't know. So it is at once amazing, but also, frankly, rightfully scary. What are some of the shortcomings? Well, look, there's actually a lot of shortcomings. Again, I don't necessarily want to just rattle off down the list here. You can eyeball it yourself, but suffice to say, internet connectivity, it's kind of spotty, hit or miss. Microsoft's Bing implementation of ChatGPT is actually pretty good. The plugin based approach, if you're paying $20 a month for ChatGPT 4 rather than ChatGPT 3.5, the free model, it's pretty hit or miss. Again, there's this big question of copyright infringement. Hallucinations, it's what you've all heard about, fabricating non-factual information that sounds perfectly competently accurate and real and correct. Obviously, a ton of potential issues with data privacy, ethical concerns. So there are a lot of things that just aren't really okay and need to be resolved for sure. So now it's important to understand how this all works, though. So fundamentally, these large language models are probability engines, right? So this is a pretty nuanced thing to explain, but this is kind of the meat of what needs to be understood in terms of making sense of how things like copyright law are going to play out. So when we talk about the number of parameters in a model, so you've certainly heard of ChatGPT 3, it had apparently something like 175 billion parameters. I feel like we need to say this in Carl Sagan's voice: 175 billion parameters and 100 trillion parameters for GPT-4. I mean, these numbers are just like literally astronomically, almost meaninglessly huge, right? But the important thing to understand is that these parameters are not like an amount of data. We're not talking about gigabytes, terabytes, whatever. We're not talking about the number of scraped web pages or characters scraped. In fact, we're not even talking about the scraped internet data at all. This is not querying an index like Google. So when you Google something, it's pulling data straight from an index, which is literally actually stored in all their data centers around the world, right? So the actual content that Google spits out is literal, actual stuff that people have written, copyrighted or otherwise, and you're being shown that content. Here, that's not happening. The output is not pulling from that training data. On the contrary, it is completely novel stuff created from the training data. Those parameters are, for lack of a better word, probabilistic word associations that the system trained itself based on the training data, which is then discarded. So the training data itself is never even used. Okay, so I think this is a critically important distinction to make. And frankly, it's one that I've never really heard discussed much. And as I said, we're going to circle back to this a third and final time when we do actually discuss the implications for copyright law, although I suspect many of you will see where this is going. So lots of small print here, but fortunately, 3 pretty colors. All that really matters is that blue and red is ChatGPT 4 and yellow is ChatGPT 3.5. And in almost every instance, the newest iteration of ChatGPT is markedly better. The far left item there is the uniform bar exam. We got the LSAT after that, SAT scores, and so on and so forth. So it's it's pretty mind-blowing. I should say at the far right as well, AP Calculus. So one of the criticisms of GPT generally was it wasn't so good at math. Yeah, well, now it's still not great, but it's a lot better than it was. And you're probably wondering what's bringing about this tremendous improvement in capability. Well, so this is not showing computational power, but specifically it's the amount of compute power being thrown at AI systems to train them. This is the compute power for training. So as you can see, up until about the 2010s or so, this power was doubling about every 2 years. Okay, great. But now all of a sudden it's doing 10x every year. I mean, so this is just like a tremendous improvement in training power capability. As an aside, you've probably seen, for instance, you've read in the news, the likes of NVIDIA, their stock is just exploding. Yeah, well, because NVIDIA's GPUs, formerly famous for video game graphics, turns out they're really, really good at powering training computers. So the result of all this is pretty mind-blowing from a product point of view. So the fastest growing product in human history was TikTok. This took a positively glacial 9 months in comparison to reach 100 million users. ChatGPT took just 2 months. That's already an incredible thing. But when you consider the context of what's happening here, it's absolutely mind-blowing. Consider for a moment, pretty much every product that you see here, these all benefited from so-called network effects. As we say in startup world, it's the sort of product where the more people get on board, the more benefit it offers to everybody else. More people gives more utility to the product, right? ChatGPT is by definition not a networky type thing. There's no value add for me to join for you to get more utility out of ChatGPT. But in contrast, if you're the only person on TikTok, you're not going to get much value out of it, right? So it's absolutely mind-blowing that with no marketing, no network effects whatsoever, ChatGPT has managed to grow this quickly. It defies reason, honestly. So to cut to the chase, that I'm sure many of us are wondering, will AI take my job? I mean, it's a good question, right? And it depends how you want to perceive what AI really is. So I kind of think of it as 2 ways. It's a utility multiplier in the sense that it can cut coding time, for instance. As a matter of fact, the CEO of help desk software Freshworks has gone on the record just recently saying that it reduced coding time from 9 weeks to just days. I mean, this is pretty amazing stuff. On the flip side, it's definitely also potentially a human replacer, where in the instance of a company called Octopus Energy in the UK, I believe, yeah, they've replaced 250 employees. I suspect these are probably support staff, not to minimize their loss of work, obviously, but just, in other words, there is a very real risk to certain types of jobs. That said, I don't think that AI is going to take everyone's job, at least not yet, but more crucially, it's really going to be the sort of thing where humans with AI, they will take your job for sure. There's no question about that. And speaking of jobs, just kind of FYI, if you ever hear the term thrown around, prompt engineering, it's kind of a neat sounding term, which it's what's kind of what it sounds like. It's the skill set for querying these chatbots to get exactly the sort of output you want. There's 2 kinds. There's plain English, just sort of how do you phrase things, what's your kind of syntax and grammar and so forth. And then there's actual Python engineering based prompt engineering as well. I just kind of wanted to make sure everyone is familiar with this. So how do you use ChatGPT? This is super quick. Look, very low barrier to entry. You go to chat.openai.com, create an account, log in, and off you go. The only thing to consider, especially if you want to use this for any sort of legal work, which presumably you do, definitely drop the $20 a month for ChatGPT 4. It is vastly superior. Yeah, just do that. It's easy to cancel at any time, no big deal. A really incredible thing too, I think it might be available for Android, I'm not sure, but there is an iOS app now for ChatGPT, which incorporates OpenAI's Whisper voice-to-text technology, which, well, we can now say with conviction that 2023 was the year, not only that we can have at least text-based correspondence with a computer completely fluently in plain natural language, but now you can do so with speech. If you think of how completely bad to the point of useless, being useless is Siri, well, this is finally the first time ever you can have completely fluent, organic, 100% natural conversation with a computer. It is absolutely mind-blowing, the contextual fluency. with which it understands your speech. Makes it a really amazing way to talk with the system. And I've tried Microsoft's implementation with Microsoft Edge and Bing, and this is definitely a lot better. All right, look, we're going to skip over prompt engineering because there isn't time for that. And so look, now we can dive into the meat of everything, really, an overview, very briefly, of AI law. So these are all the topics we're going to touch on. I don't want to rattle things off in the interest of time since I managed to kill a few minutes at the beginning. But let's just dive in and get started, shall we? And yes, obviously this requires its own CLE course, so just let me know if interested. So we'll start with US law, mostly because it's frankly the most fragmented. I wanted to leave the more structured bit for the end. So again, I'm going to sort of just fly through a lot of this in the interest of time, but you don't really have any federal law yet on what's what when it comes to AI. We do have, however, a whole bunch of statements from the alphabet soup of organizations and administrations. Generally speaking, there's obviously a lot of concern, rightfully so, about things like discrimination, fraud, data misuse. There's a tremendous and justified concern around discrimination and bias. These large language models, obviously what goes in comes out, so garbage in, garbage out. So it's really, that is actually one of the most dangerous issues, or I guess concerning issues anyway. Also, we're very concerned with, and we'll see this in a moment when we talk about state laws, there's a real concern about so-called, life-altering type of decisions that are made with the assistance of chatbots. So just a day or two ago, I think, the CFPB has announced that there is definitely a risk of breaking the law for chatbots that give faulty advice, financial advice. So for example, a lot of banks now use chatbots. I believe it's Chase, which is trying to set up a bot with ChatGPT and OpenAI, but other banks are using other third-party large language models and chatbots generally. And so there's a big concern there that if these things start to provide bad advice, which is very possible, because we'll discuss a bit later, these things, one of the biggest problems is how correct they sound. I mean, they sound really, really accurate all of the time. So that's a big concern there. NIST is concerned with making sure we have some sort of a framework focusing on government risk assessment, tracking and management. I think what's most impressive, though, is, and I'm sure many of you have heard about this, so Sam Altman, the CEO and co-founder of OpenAI, the makers of ChatGPT, so he spoke to the Senate Judiciary Committee on May 16th of 23 regarding his desire for regulatory intervention. And indeed, he's doing a round the world tour right now, talking with leaders of countries around the world, effectively begging for regulation. I mean, when was the last time you heard about a CEO of a tech company, especially begging for government regulation? This is a pretty mind-blowing thing. And indeed, it's why he and so many others, I think something like 600 AI researchers have now co-signed a document begging for a 6-month pause on public testing of AI, and just really desperate for some sort of proper framework and regulation. We'll touch on this more at the end, why it's such a dangerous, risky thing. In particular, Sam's been asking for things like an agency to issue licenses for AI models, a very obvious need for safety standards, and frankly, the need for independent audits. States have been stepping up the pace at getting some sort of law in the books, somewhat similar to the issue, the concern with banking, right? So California is proposing rules for any sort of automated decision tools that can make so-called consequential decisions for things like housing, employment, health, voting, and lending. This kind of makes sense, right? Because again, we're very concerned, it's one thing to use a chatbot for studying, say, quantum physics, I suppose. But if you're using a chatbot to make really informed decisions on things involving housing, employment, or health, yeah, probably a rather riskier thing. And then Maryland and Illinois and Texas are quite concerned with the use of facial geometry, biometric information. There needs to be consent, that sort of thing. We're very concerned with using one's face with or without consent, even if in the case of Texas, even if there's no name association. New York, I think, has a pretty neat thing. They basically require, they're not saying you can't use AI for hiring tools, but it must be the case that you have auditing to make sure there's no bias in that. Because again, this kind of goes back to the whole AI for life-defining decisions. That's risky. We want to make sure it's done safely. The worst possible thing that could occur is if we try to say, hey, we're just not going to allow any AI at all. That's just not going to work. So what is rather more important, and by the way, this is a discussion that pops up a lot in education, right? A lot of teachers, professors are frankly freaking out about ChatGPT in particular. It's not about disallowing people to use it. It's about making sure it's regulated, it's structured, and there are some bounds set on its use. All right, so now things get super fun, super exciting when we talk about copyright law. I mean, this is really neat because it's such a profoundly important area of law, and everything happening with generative AI is effectively almost uprooting everything, right? And I think it begins with a fundamental misunderstanding of how LLMs work, which, as you'll see, I think, is why we touched on so much of the technical back end of how these work. And we're gonna, as I said, this is the third time now we're gonna kind of really make sure we connect all the dots here. So again, an LLM, a large language model, is a generative AI, or a type of generative AI. GPT, as we said, it's a generative pre-trained transformer. So what does transformer actually mean? We said earlier it has to do with contextual understanding of kind of comparing one word to another. But what does this mean? All right, well, check this out. So the cat sits on the what? So it's trying to output a sentence. The cat sits on the. And so it starts to go kind of through its like decision tree of probabilistic word associations, as we talked about earlier, right? Because remember, the LLM is not actually recalling the training data itself. It's using only the probabilistic word associations that itself has created from the training data, right? So it encounters the word cheeseburger and it thinks, well, that would be cute, but probably not very likely. Okay, next, how about the piano? You know, does the cat sit on the piano, or indeed even in the piano in this case? Okay, having grown up with both cats and pianos, I suppose it's definitely possible and indeed somewhat probable. How about just sitting on the floor? Well, given the context of the sentence and indeed the prior discussion so far, yeah, that's probably the most likely output, and hence that's the result that it produces. So that's how a transformer model works. This is where things get very, very odd very quickly. Again, the parameters of an LLM, whether it's the 175 billion in a GPT-3 or the 100 trillion in GPT-4, these are not the training data. Again, you Google something, you're querying the actual index of the actual web page contents. But with LLMs, you are querying the probabilistic word associations based on the training data. So what this means then is that the output that's produced is entirely novel content. It's based on patterns. It's not based on any sort of actual training data. It's not copying any of that training data whatsoever. In fact, therefore, there's effectively a vanishingly small, it's basically zero, but okay, I guess theoretically it's not zero, but it's effectively practically 0% probability that it's going to reproduce original content verbatim. And so when you think about it that way, one could argue, as I do, that it's simply not capable of copyright infringement. Now, there's a really important distinction. I'm sure a lot of you are wondering, if you ask ChatGPT, and by the way, I just did this morning to make sure I wasn't like imagining things. If you ask ChatGPT, hey, what were the opening lines of Star Wars? It'll correctly spit out C-3PO saying, did you hear that? They've shut down the main reactor, which is a correct and accurate reproduction of what C-3PO said. If you ask ChatGPT to output what were the opening lines of the novelization of Star Wars, it cannot do that. And indeed, it will not do that because it doesn't actually store that sort of stuff for output. But the reason why the spoken dialogue from a film is okay, it's because it's sort of a colloquial thing of everyday speech, and it's not actually reproducing content verbatim from a book. If you ask it to reproduce the soliloquy from Hamlet, it will do that because also that's in the public domain, and in any event, that's that's obviously fair use, and it's a very popular, famous thing. But in general, it's not going to reproduce copyrighted content because it's literally actually not able to work with that content. It's just working with probabilistic word associations, and that's it. So yeah, is there a potential copyright violation with any of this output content? Well, let's say you've got training data going in to an LLM model, which outputs the probability engine generated result. Was there a derivative work produced? Well, here's a hint. I mean, obviously your content would have gone into it by virtue of having ingested everything from the internet, true. But again, it's a trick question, right? Because remember, the output is from the LLM. It's not from the training data. What about trade secrets and things like that? Well, yeah, probably there's going to be some sort of breach of confidentiality. I mean, in general, and this hopefully goes without saying, if you're ever using ChatGPT or otherwise, please redact everything that's confidential, obviously, because yeah, it's true. It's not going to be directly accessed for outputting new content, but it is also true that whatever you input into ChatGPT is itself further going towards boosting its training. It will be used as training data. So in any event, yeah, just don't submit anything personally identifying or otherwise confidential. So a lot of things here, again, I don't want to just read things verbatim to you because that's super boring. But suffice to say, as a reminder, works created by AI without human intervention cannot be copyrighted. The idea is we need to have some sort of sufficient human involvement, right? So you can't just type in a prompt to Midjourney, the image generation tool, which I used to create all the imagery for this presentation, by the way. That's not sufficient, right? So there needs to be some sort of material kind of improvement thing rather than just simply prompting it. AI produced stuff is just, as yet anyway, probably not going to be recognized. And I think that's, you know, at least in terms of gut feeling, I think that probably makes sense. I mean, look, there's a lot of thought that has to go into the actual natural language English prompting to produce the sort of output you want. I mean, these things are pretty advanced and detailed, right? So I don't know how many of you have tried them, but when you're prompting an image generator, you're not just giving subject matter information, you're also giving things like lighting and the camera type, the lens used, the angle, the position, and so on and so forth. So it's not that it's a trivial thing to do, but indeed, I guess as a function of the whole product, it's decidedly not as hands-on as, say, actually making the thing. Yes, obviously, but for the prompt, there wouldn't be any sort of image output. That's true. But as far as actual practical work product that goes into it, yeah, it just isn't sufficient. And I think I agree with this, actually. So let me give you an example, right? So like many people, I decided to try and use Midjourney to create prints to sell them because why not? Frankly, it's a lot of fun too. So the process is generally, you know, you give a prompt to Midjourney, it outputs an image. You create a Printify and Etsy account, you link the two. Printify produces the canvas framed print, which then gets dropped into your Etsy store, and then you sell it. Is there a copyright? Yeah, probably not. And that's the point, because I didn't really do anything, right? I just prompted an image and then Printify, and well, Printify did all the actual creation of the product, which was then sold on Etsy. So yeah, probably no copyright. And this kind of makes sense. And again, I realize everything involving copyright law definitely needs its own course. But I think that's all we've got for that for the time being anyway. What about things like privacy? So again, there isn't really anything about privacy, at least not at a federal level. There's a proposed blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. Schumer's got these 4 guardrails which target the who, the where, the what, and the need to protect. This is kind of sensible, I suppose. We want to know and identify who's trained the LLM and who's the intended audience. And again, this really matters because when you're talking about LLM training data, it's critically important to know, yeah, who did that, who provided the training data, and ultimately who is it used for. This is going to be a particularly important thing when we discuss the actual practical use of ChatGPT in law, as we're about to in a moment, and why, frankly, it fails in so many ways. We have to disclose the data source. We have to understand and explain the output. And ultimately, we need to be super transparent about the ethical bounds of the AI content. As you'll see in a moment, this is actually somewhat similar, somewhat overlapping to what the EU have just launched with the EU AI Act. We'll get to that in a moment. Real quick, a comment about US patent law. Look, very simple. Basically, an inventor needs to be human. An AI-generated invention is not granted patents in Australia, the EU, the UK, but apparently it is in South Africa. So if you want to use ChatGPT to invent something, probably do it in South Africa. All right, what about software code? So this is pretty neat, coming especially for me, my interest as a startup founder. I find this remarkably interesting. So as many of you might know, besides the fact that ChatGPT itself can create so much great code on the fly, things like Microsoft Visual Studio Code and indeed other products, GitHub, for instance, they have the ability now to help you produce code as well. What's really important, though, is to make sure that your output code is not bound to what's probably an open source license, because if you do, or rather if it is, you're very likely in big trouble. So it's an important thing to keep in mind. And again, the idea is, again, you're using an AI system where the code generation is probably bound to an open source license. If it does the vast majority of your code for you, it's going to be bound to that open source license too, at least probably. So something super important to keep in mind. So now we get to something with a bit more structure. It's the EU AI law. Just want to kick this off with a funny sort of anecdote, which I guess many of you noticed as well. So back in March, due to GDPR violations, Italy decided to pull the plug on ChatGPT. Not 1 month later, they're like, okay, cool, we're going to reactivate it for you guys. And so now ChatGPT is once again live in Italy. It turned out this was a pretty trivial issue, something about the language in the GDPR opt-in, opt-out form just had to be more clear. OpenAI did this, but it also raised a lot of red flags. And I think Sam Altman has gone on the record saying that he's actually rather concerned whether OpenAI will continue to be able to, operate in the EU and conform with all their requirements, because at some point it becomes very, very tricky to conform, as we'll see in a bit. So what the EU AI Act has done, it's produced this sort of hierarchy of conduct, right? So at the very bottom, we've got minimal risk, for which, okay, no big deal. Things like using AI for spam filters and video games. As a quick aside, it turns out that you'll now soon be able to talk to non-playable characters in video games using AI like ChatGPT. So pretty cool application. But look, obviously this is a minimal risk thing, so no need for higher scrutiny on its safety. Going up one rung on the ladder here, limited risk type of actions require some transparency into what's going on. This to me is a bit odd. Chatbots, deepfakes, and motion recognition systems. So I want to kind of just do an aside here for a moment. This is weird to me that deepfakes and chatbots are so low on this list here, because again, it's like this perfect intersection of chatbots and deepfakes that can truly, really upend civilization in many ways. I believe it was Max Tegmark, one of the leading AI researchers, who made clear that the risk with AI, and again, we're going to loop back towards this at the end, the risk with AI is that it could potentially hack the OS of humanity, the OS of civilization, which is obviously language. I mean, if you see somebody, talking about a thing and it looks like somebody, I mean, the whole looks like a duck, quacks like a duck thing just doesn't even exist anymore. That's no longer a valid test, right? So this is the concern with so-called AI 2.0, right? It's a distinction as between the first generation of AI, which was sort of AI curated content that went out through social media, sort of optimizing your Instagram feed to kind of hook you and show you what you care about. Now it's not just simply a matter of curating content, it's a matter of creating novel content too. And this ends up being a very scary thing. And we know that it's a risk because, I mean, it doesn't matter your political point of view. We're literally living in an era where people are still debating things like who won the election, whether vaccines work or not, whether the world is flat, whether we landed on the moon. I'm not suggesting that people didn't have these, call them beliefs or whatever you want, in the past. Of course they did. But the difference is that now it's very easy to spread this sort of misinformation. And so that's kind of the proof that AI 1.0 already posed a huge risk. So now we've got this very serious risk of AI 2.0. So that's why I'm a little surprised that things like chatbots and deepfakes are kind of low on this list. But anyway, let's carry on. High risk issues: education, employment, justice, immigration, and law. Obviously, this is then the bit that I said was rather similar to what we're suggesting here in the US. And again, that makes sense. These are very kind of life-altering type of things. And finally, totally prohibited things are things like social scoring, facial recognition, dark pattern AI, manipulation of sorts. So I think this is a pretty good approach. I mean, it sounds great on paper, right? But the problem is, how is this actually going to be enforced? I mean, that is actually the big risk with AI, right? It's precisely the fact that it's effectively invisible if it's done right, and if it's done well. So I really don't know. I mean, this sounds great. I don't know how it's going to manifest. There are, however, some pretty big fines. So 6% global revenue for non-compliance in the EU. There's also an interesting distinction made as between general purpose versus foundation models. which is what GPT-4 is. So kind of owing to the risks, the concerns we just discussed, right? There's this very real concern that not only can AI models like ChatGPT really cause serious damage to practical matters in the world, but crucially to democracy itself. Because again, if there is no test to validate whether a thing or a person is real and authentic, this is a really scary thing, right? And so we need to have really much stricter scrutiny for this sort of content. And indeed, all generative AI companies must disclose all copyrighted materials used in training. Again, I don't know how this is going to happen practically, because this is a really broad request. And interestingly enough, breaking news as of just a couple of days ago, lo and behold, Japan has just said precisely the opposite, which frankly is exactly the argument that I made earlier. Copyrights will not be enforced with AI training data. Now I realize the way I worded this, it's a bit ambiguous. It could kind of go either way, but to be super clear, what they're saying is, yeah, the training data that goes into an AI model, and because of the way that the output content is indeed novel and not reproducing that training data, but rather just based on those probabilistic word associations that we discussed earlier, yeah, no copyright infringement. So that's it. Japan's just taken the first step in that direction. And I have to say, I wholeheartedly agree. Now, there are exceptions, obviously. What we're talking about here is text-based content, right? So you may have heard not too long ago, Drake, I believe it was Drake, he had his voice reproduced with AI, and he there was a song that was produced, sounded just like him. I think that's a different thing entirely. But if we're talking about text, I really do strongly agree with this. Also, breaking news, OpenAI was just sued for defamation. I think this is worth mentioning. It's a pretty interesting thing. It's a bit convoluted, but basically there was a journalist who was researching a lawsuit, right? Journalist basically pinged ChatGPT for some input. And for some reason, this poor guy, Mark Walters, was apparently dragged into the mess, saying that he had, he had been accused of fraud and embezzlement. And this guy is like, what? I don't even know who these people are. I have nothing to do with the case. So yeah, so Mark Walters is now suing OpenAI for defamation, which I think is the first such case of its kind. By the way, if you're interested in breaking news about AI, I do this daily newsletter. I think I mentioned it at the start before I lost connection with you guys. But yeah, futureperfect.news every morning. So let's then finally touch on how best to integrate ChatGPT with your law practice. I will go on the record time and again saying that any law practice, indeed any business really not fully embracing AI, will be dead or dying by 25. I'm going to fly through because we are short on time since we had that botched start, but 44% of legal tasks will be automated by AI. Yes, it's almost 50-50 split about, skeptics amongst all of us. I'm not going to go through this now, but just as a reminder, I'm sure you've all heard of it now, the famous thing that happened a couple of weeks ago, the lawyer in New York with Avianca Airlines, the bogus case pulled up by, cases pulled up by ChatGPT. I don't understand why everybody's making such a big deal about this, frankly. I mean, you could be incompetent with any tool, whether it's Lexis, Westlaw, the internet itself, frankly, as a whole. I mean, the fact is, if you're going to use a tool, be competent about it. I mean, he should have known. Granted, the risk is that ChatGPT makes it very easy to think that it's to believe that it's correct. And so I get it. It is more risky. It is more dangerous. But at the end of the day, it's just another tool. So remember what Spidey says: with great power comes great responsibility. Don't be a fool. You're the lawyer, not the tool. So that's all I'm going to say about that, frankly. There are some interesting developments, though. I've got a good friend of mine, she's a district attorney general. Their office is not allowed to use ChatGPT or similar. Texas, there's a standing order from a judge saying that, look, if you're going to use ChatGPT or any other sort of generative AI, you've got to file on the docket a certificate of testing that no portion of the filing was drafted by such AI, or alternatively, that you were basically the final set of eyes. I think this makes the most sense, and I like it a lot. So what are some of the best use cases for generative AI? Yeah, legal research, letters to clients, blah, blah, blah. Role-playing is a really good one, I think, because this enables you to really simulate and practice future encounters, conversations. That's a pretty powerful thing. You can basically dump in a whole list of fact patterns and then have kind of a back and forth one-on-one. It's very cool. We touched on a lot of these. So again, in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of gloss over this. But yeah, these are the concerns. So just obviously be aware of them. A quick discussion, this was raised in another discussion a while back. Is there an unauthorized practice of law issue if AI is generating content, and especially if there's no copyright? Well, that's how the discussion was framed. I think it's an irrelevant point. The issue of whether there's a copyright to the output content has no bearing on whether there's any sort of UPL. What matters, again, is that you are simply the last set of eyeballs on whatever that output content is. So again, I think a lot of this is just common sense. The concern, again, is that it's very easy to be wrong. Quick thing, I hope it's reproduced well enough on your end because we do not have time to go through this all, but talk about Meta. I got ChatGPT to produce a new ethics rule for California, and it's pretty remarkable. So if you can read it, I encourage you to give it a read. It's pretty great stuff. Quick comment, looks like Lexis, to the surprise of absolutely nobody, is developing their own product in conjunction with ChatGPT. Earlier, we talked about matters, where does that training data come from? Well, this is what I mean. Lexis is going to be ingesting all of its so-called training data into ChatGPT, its own model of ChatGPT. Hence, the outputs should finally be spot on and no more sad-faced lawyers in New York suing airlines. By the way, I do talk about this and help lawyers with integrating technology like generative AI. So you can find it here. I was pretty excited I actually managed to get this domain. So what's next? I know we're very nearly out of time. Obviously, want to leave room for questions. I will fly through this quickly. Again, we talked about this issue from the very beginning. Here's the point. Everything's accelerating at a much faster pace than expected. Even more surprising is that things have occurred in the inverse. We expected first kind of big lumbering robots, and then very kind of high level human cognition capability, and then very deep philosophical, intelligent cognition many, many decades hence. And it's actually turned out to be the exact opposite. This has produced kind of a spectrum of results from the dangerous to the great. Right now, the concern is that, we're basically doing all this public testing of AI when it shouldn't be. Yes, it's raising the baseline, so everybody is potentially an expert in a thing, but that's also dangerous if you're not actually an expert. On the other hand, Jensen Huang, the NVIDIA CEO, said as much, right? So the AI will serve as an assistant that'll enable anyone to be a programmer. And this is actually a true statement. But ultimately, I think what's really beautiful about this, and I do mean that in the truest sense of the word, is that for the first time in human history, we can now focus on trying to do things that we love and not simply those things that we happen to be best at. So where are we with AI? Look, it's not sentient yet, but it is growing at double exponential speeds. And it's really good at faking sentience, but we probably will be there within a decade or so. I'm reminded of this really awesome comic, which I think is pretty on point. So yeah, you will actually find yourself being rather polite, I think, with ChatGPT over time if you use it enough, or maybe it's just me for being weird. Everybody's obviously jumping on board with generative AI. These, if you recognize the little bits in the squares, those were the original album covers, which now Photoshop can, using generative AI, fill in the expanded canvas. Pretty mind-blowing. I actually tried it myself. I made this image in Midjourney, and boom, Photoshop filled in the surrounding region. We've talked a bit about the concerns with AI, the issues of testing, actual real harm. I know a lot of you are thinking, but there's no chance we're going to have a Terminator 2 type future. Don't forget, harm need not require big robots and sentience. There's plenty of intelligent life that isn't necessarily sentient. So something to keep in mind. And finally, a thought to leave you on. The concern with AI isn't that it's going to try to hunt us down and kill us as humans. It's rather the concern of hyper-optimizing for one variable. So for instance, it might say something like, hey, that oxygen stuff is remarkably corrosive. We should probably reduce it a bit, and then all humans die. Yeah, that's not because they hated humans. I mean, it's really the equivalent to how we have airplanes crashing into migrating geese. It's not that we hate geese. It's not that we, hated elephants and nearly drove them to extinction. It was just sort of a byproduct of our life. So to end on a happy note, hopefully, I'll just read you a couple of words of a thing that I wrote. I just think it's critically important that we temper AI before we lose it forever, depriving ourselves of all the wondrous innovation and beauty it can bring. This current blend of public-facing LLMs, it's one of the most powerful tools humanity has ever seen, but it's also the most beautiful. It's a catalyst for innovation and creativity, equally as potent for science as for art. It is finally the technology that enables a blind person to figure out recipes conjured up from a photo from the refrigerator's contents. True story, by the way. It gives a 50-year-old truck driver finally the capability to shift gears from trucking to coding. And yeah, it helps newly minted lawyers open their law practice, a stay-at-home parent to launch an Etsy store full of art. So if computers are our tools and the internet's the medium in which we work, then AI, I think, is surely the USB stick in our brains, perpetual drip feed of boundless knowledge for us to tap at will. So thanks very much for listening. Happy to take whatever questions there are.
So we have a few questions on in the Q&A if you want to open the Q&A.
Yeah, let me see. Okay, let's see. Where shall we start here? I mean, I'm seeing a lot of comments that I agree with. Yes, ChatGPT obviously responds to fake case briefs. That is indeed the concern. This is why something like Lexis is such an important thing. They're going to be ingesting their own data into ChatGPT. Do Bard and Bing use public data? Yeah, so Bard and Bing, the ones that are web connected, are indeed pulling from websites. They are what's called web connected. ChatGPT, unless you enable it in plugins, is just going based on its model, which is derived from training data, which is cut off from September of 21, I believe. Are we already at AI 2.0 or is that next? Yeah, this is basically the advent of 2.0. This is basically the early days of AI 2.0 for sure. That's why it's so critically important that we get things right from the beginning before they get very, very wrong very quickly. The image sources say, yeah, me via Midjourney 5.1. Yeah, so Midjourney is an image generation tool that it's complicated to set up. You basically run it within a service called Discord. So it's not part of ChatGPT, although you can use ChatGPT to create Midjourney prompts. Okay, someone's pointing out that the ethics rule that was drafted is hard to read. I guess I will submit it somewhere and hopefully everybody can access that. Jose, is that possible?
So I'll go ahead and materials were sent before the program, but I'll drop it in the chat right now so people can just download the slides.
Yep. Okay.
If you cannot read any of the slides, you guys can email us and we'll just send
exactly,
you one slide.
Exactly. Let's see if there's an idea for a business card. Can AI create the picture? Yeah. So Midjourney is really great for that. It'll basically do any image in any style you like. The future for Bard and Google. Yeah, look, I think there's definitely room for plenty of players in this space. It's not going to just be ChatGPT. And I think obviously Google being Google, they're going to continue to do a lot of great progress in this space. So by all means, use both interchangeably. But again, with respect to law specifically, super important to bear in mind the risks, the dangers. But yeah, if anybody has access to Lexis plus AI, I think that's the thing to try for sure. What else have we missed here? I think that's more or less everything. I just noticed the very first question, indeed, it's the recent Daily Journal article, the attorney who had AI write a motion. I mean, I don't know if this is the same thing as New York, but again, it is going to fabricate content. So it is super important to double check and make sure that everything is accurate. Absolutely. Jose, what do you think? Any other questions that are worth bouncing off here?
That is all.
All right.
And I gotta say thank you everyone for attending. If you guys should receive a certificate within 10 minutes of the program finishing. And thank you, Mark, for doing this program.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
And we'll probably have you next year. So guys, be ready.
Sounds like a plan. A lot will be different in a year.
For sure. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, bye-bye.